Blake barely managed to step through the front door. His body felt heavy with exhaustion after another grueling day. His hands were calloused, and his head ached. As a construction project manager, his work revolved around solving problems, but he often lent his strength to carpentry work once those problems were addressed. His home was his sanctuary, his happy place. However, as soon as he stepped inside, he realized something was off. A suitcase stood by the door. Blake froze. Then his gaze fell on Susan. She was sitting on the edge of the couch, her posture unusually straight, her expression brighter than it should have been. "Don't worry," Susan said in an exaggeratedly cheerful voice. "I'm not leaving you." Blake blinked, trying to gather his thoughts. His silence was instinctive. Years of experience had taught him to keep his mouth shut and listen when situations grew tense, and his intuition told him this was one of those moments. Feeling disoriented, with a growing sense that something terrible was happening, he tossed his keys onto the side table. "I just wanted to handle this first," Susan continued, standing up. Her nervous energy revealed itself in her movements. She smiled, wide, even excited, but there was something off about it. It was too forced. "This is going to sound, well, bad at first, but I have to tell you." Blake's gaze darted to the suitcase, his mind piecing together facts he didn't want to acknowledge. "What's going on?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse with fatigue and confusion. Susan took a deep breath, like someone preparing to share good news. "I'm going away for a week," she said with excessive enthusiasm, "with Roger." For a moment, silence blanketed the room. Blake stood there, as if his body had forgotten how to move or react. Roger, her boss, the arrogant jerk who always seemed to think everyone else was beneath him. That Roger. "You're leaving with Roger," Blake said in a steady tone. It wasn't a question or a statement. It was more like an acknowledgement of what he had just understood. Susan hurried to continue, a mixture of guilt and excitement evident in her demeanor. I know. At first, it sounds bad, but I don't think it really is. I've been seeing him for a while, but that's not the point." She stepped closer, her eyes shining with a childlike frivolity, as if confessing something both embarrassing and thrilling. "The point is, I didn't plan this. I mean, it's Roger. Roger. You know how he is. He wanted me, and, well, I couldn't say no to him. He's so persuasive, you know. Once he decides he wants something, he gets it." She let out a quiet, almost inaudible laugh. "And he wanted me." Blake stared at her, his mind struggling to process her words. She spoke about Roger as if he were a force of nature, something inevitable. And her tone, was there pride in it? It felt surreal. Her words echoed in his head, empty and strange. "That's why I'm telling you," she continued, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "I didn't want to hide it from you anymore. I feel so much better just telling you, you know. No more secrets. It's like a weight has been lifted off my shoulders, and I didn't want to lie about the trip." She gestured to the suitcase. "Roger and I are leaving for a week. He thinks it'll be good for us to truly enjoy each other without having to hide, you know, just to be together." Blake opened his mouth but couldn't utter a word. His thoughts swirled like a storm, and his emotions began to boil. He couldn't comprehend it, couldn't grasp the reality of the situation. How could Susan stand there, so excited, so casual, talking about something that had shattered the very foundation of their marriage? "Don't worry," Susan quickly added, her face lighting up again. "It's only for a week. After that, we'll go back to normal life. I'll come back to you, Blake. I love you. There's no reason for this to come between us." She waved her hands dismissively, as if brushing off the entire situation, is just a coincidence. A little hiccup. Roger just wanted me, and now, once he's had me, it'll be over in a week, and then I'll return. Then we can really focus on building our family. Blake's heart pounded heavily in his chest. A ringing filled his ears. How could she be so cheerful, so bright and happy? She spoke of her infidelity as if it meant nothing, as if Blake himself meant nothing. Susan was clearly infatuated with Roger. She had resigned herself to it because what else could she do? It was Roger. "I know this might come as a shock, but you've always been so understanding, Blake. That's one of the reasons I love you. You're balanced, you never make a fuss, and that's why I know we'll get through this." She stepped closer, holding out a folded piece of paper. "Roger and I talked about it. Just to make sure everything goes smoothly, you know. We wrote something down, a guide for you." Blake stared at the piece of paper in her hand, his mind numb. Susan held the list out to him. It's really nothing special. Just a few guidelines to make sure everything goes smoothly while I'm gone. His hands trembled as he unfolded the paper. Some of the phrases were stark and clear. 1. No arguments before or after the trip. We all want to keep things peaceful. 2. Don't tell anyone about what we're doing. 3. No posts on social media about any of this. 4. No discussion about what we're doing, about any of this. 5. No discussions about divorce or living separately. This is just a fling. 6. Calmly wait at home until the trip is over, then focus on the future. Family plans should remain as discussed previously. Blake felt his breath catch. No arguments. Don't tell anyone. No divorce. He couldn't stomach such audacity. The assumption that he would simply comply while his wife spent a week with another man was beyond outrageous. The sheer arrogance of these two betrayers was both astounding and naive. Susan's voice broke his silence. See? Nothing unusual. Just a few simple things to make sure everything goes smoothly. Roger thinks very highly of you, you know. He said you'd handle it just fine. This might be hard, but it'll all be over soon, and we'll go back to the way things were. You're not the jealous type, Blake. You're practical. I know this is difficult, but everything will be fine. You're not going to make a big deal out of nothing, right? Her wide eyes were filled with hope, almost pleading. But beneath that hope lay a certainty, an absolute belief that everything would be fine because, of course, Blake wouldn't make a fuss. Of course, he wouldn't argue. He was her rock. Divorce was unthinkable, not in her world. Blake's hands clenched the list. His mind screamed at him to say something, anything. But he had no words. What could he possibly say? Susan smiled, mistaking his silence for agreement. I knew you'd understand, she said softly, relief washing over her face. I was so nervous, but you've always given me what I needed. You've always been there for me, and you always will be. She leaned in and quickly pecked him on the cheek. I'll be back next Friday afternoon, she said, grabbing her suitcase and bouncing cheerfully. Then everything will go back to normal, and we can talk about starting a family, okay? Blake watched as she walked out the door, pausing to turn back with a radiant smile as though everything in the world was perfectly fine. Then she was gone. Blake stood there, clutching the folded list in his fist. It was almost laughable, a guide, as if his actions were something they could control, something they could dictate and manage with a few simple rules, as if it wasn't his marriage they had trampled on. For a moment, he stood frozen, his mind still reeling. But then something began to burn inside him. A fire ignited, and it wasn't confusion or a broken heart. It was rage, and it was growing. Blake had always been adept at fixing things. When the situation called for it, he could be a negotiator, solving any problem. If firm action was required, he took it without hesitation. He could do whatever the situation demanded once he determined what needed to be done. What he was feeling now was familiar, a problem requiring a particular approach, but it wouldn't be the kind Roger and Susan would appreciate. He looked over the list again, the audacity, the arrogance, to think they had even the slightest hope of keeping him under control. It was foolish to seriously believe he would follow their instructions and play the role they'd assigned him. Susan thought everything would go back to normal when she returned. He could almost hear Roger's voice, laying out conditions as if this were some kind of game. Blake read through the list once more and began to smile. For Susan and Roger, this was about limitations, boundaries, making sure no complications arose. It was all about how they managed him, how they kept him in check. Blake had a different perspective. The list made it clear what they were worried about, what they feared, and what they thought he might do. In his hands, this wasn't a contract. It was a spark, a beginning. If they were going to give him a list, well, he could come up with something better. Far better. A grim, wicked smile spread across his face as the pieces began to fall into place. His mind sharpened. Blake wasn't one to yell or throw things in anger. No, his fury was never loud. Blake's anger was quiet, calculated. He had built his career solving problems, and this betrayal was the biggest problem he had ever faced. How do you solve big problems, step by step? Their list was too short and far too naive. It didn't even cover half of what needed to be done. Blake would create a much more thorough plan. He walked into the kitchen, tossed their pathetic list onto the table, yanked open a drawer, and pulled out a notebook and pen. He was in the zone now. His mind was firing on all cylinders. He knew how to solve problems. It was time to tackle the issue of his unfaithful wife and her conniving boss. He would resolve this just as he resolved everything else, by staying 10 steps ahead. His new list wouldn't be pleasant. It wouldn't be short. Blake's to-do list began to take shape. 1. Freeze all joint accounts. Blake managed all the accounts. He had always taken care of the finances. He wasn't cruel, but he wouldn't make things easy for her. All automatic payments, deposits, or shared accounts would be shut down. Her money would remain untouched, but his would be entirely off limits to her. 2. Change the locks. When she returned, her key wouldn't work anymore. This house, their home, no longer belonged to her. She had made her choice, and if she needed a place to stay, she could knock on Roger's door. She would find nothing for herself here. 3. Sell the house. There were too many memories, and none of them were worth preserving. He would put the house on the market while she was away and never look back. By the time Susan returned, the house would no longer be his problem, just like she wouldn't be. 4. Pack up her belongings. All of Susan's things would go into storage. Blake would, of course, pack them carefully and leave them for her to collect later. Clothes, trinkets, photos, everything that tied her to him would be boxed up and put away. He'd even arranged to send all their shared furniture with her. He was starting a new life somewhere else. He didn't need reminders. 5. Gather evidence. Susan had taken her phone with her, but Blake had handled all her tech needs. He would buy a new phone for her number and restore it using Susan's cloud account. All her messages, emails, and photos would be in his hands. The phone she used to contact him would stop working, but she could sort that out when she returned. 6. Speak with an attorney. Divorce wasn't up for negotiation. It was a foregone conclusion. Blake would hire the best lawyer in town and start the paperwork immediately. No separation or reconciliation. Be realistic. Be decisive. 7. Talk to Roger's wife. They expected Blake to stay silent and maintain peace. But why should he? Maybe Roger was used to calling the shots, but Blake had no incentive to cooperate. He'd make sure to share all the evidence he anticipated finding, now that he knew where to start looking. 8. Focus on the future. This wasn't the end of Blake's life. It was simply the end of Susan's place in it. He would leave town and start fresh somewhere new. He wouldn't waste his time on bitterness. For now, his focus was on this list. Blake leaned back, tapping his pen against the paper. Planning felt good. He wasn't going to beg. He wasn't going to fight for something already broken. No, he was taking control in a way neither Susan nor Roger could have anticipated. He was reclaiming his life from people who thought they could use it as they pleased. Now that he had his plan, by the time Susan returned, the world she thought she knew would already be gone. Blake stood in the middle of the empty living room. The house was now bare. Everything had been cleared out, not just Susan's belongings, but everything. Her clothes, shoes, even the little trinkets were packed up and neatly stored in one of 2 storage units outside. His own belongings were in the other unit, ready for whatever came next. His friends had helped him move it all, asking no questions. By now, they all knew the story, but they kept their noses out of it. They just did what needed to be done in exchange for pizza and beer. That had been the easy part. Physical labor always came naturally to Blake. Sweat, muscle, determination, he could handle that. The hardest part was keeping his mind clear. Over the past few days, he had experienced a whirlwind of emotions. Betrayal, rage, disbelief all simmered just beneath the surface. But he couldn't let it boil over. Not yet. Blake took one final look around the house. It was no longer a home, just an empty shell. The walls seemed thinner, the air colder. The house had been scrubbed clean, every trace of their shared life erased. He would never set foot here again, and that thought felt right. Everything had been tainted, and then there was the title. That sweet irony, it was his house. The house they had never bothered to put her name on. Susan had lived here, played here, but it had never been hers. Blake chuckled bitterly. She probably never even thought about it, just assumed she and Blake would stay here forever. She was wrong. His lawyer had been efficient and prepared the divorce papers with precision. No long conversations, no drama. Blake wasn't going to drag this out. The documents were finalized and ready to be filed the moment she returned. If she returned, he no longer cared. The most effort had gone into Susan's phone. Of course, she had taken it with her when she and Roger left. But Susan had always been careless with her passwords and trusted Blake completely. And why wouldn't she? He had been loyal to her, an unwavering rock she had taken for granted. He sat at the kitchen table, staring coldly and intently at the restored phone in his hand. It looked exactly like her phone, because it was. He had remotely deactivated her service, replaced the phone, and restored everything from her cloud backup. It had been almost too easy. And he found everything he needed. Her messages with Roger were revolting. It wasn't just the affair itself, which Blake had prepared himself for, but the way they spoke about him. Roger, ever the smug one, dismissively brushed off Blake as no threat. He's too nice, he'll put up with it. Blake could almost hear the arrogance in the typed words. Susan's responses cut even deeper. It'll be fine. He won't make a fuss. He never does. He felt bile rise in his throat but swallowed it down. He won't make a fuss. That's how she saw him. Not as a partner, not as a man she respected, but as a doormat. A man too weak to stand up for himself. And then there were the photos. Of course, there were photos. Apparently, Roger enjoyed capturing moments of Susan pleasing him and then sending them to her. Blake found himself wondering what kind of person could do something like that. Roger had even sent her an email confirming their trip, gloating over how clever he was. Blake's lips curled in contempt. They were careless, arrogant, and they thought they were untouchable. All of it, taken together, formed a perfect expose. The messages, the photos, the undeniable evidence of their affair. Everything was documented, neatly organized, and shared publicly. Not just with his divorce lawyer, but also with Roger's wife. Additionally, it was sent to the board of directors at Roger's company. A slightly edited version was posted on social media. Blake ensured it wouldn't be flagged for nudity, but it was damning enough to expose the truth. He had gone to great lengths to make sure everyone who knew Susan or Roger got the news. Blake meticulously handled the matter of Roger's wife. This wasn't about revenge, not entirely, but the woman deserved to know. She had a right to the truth, just as he did. And surprisingly, she accepted it, perhaps too graciously. The silence on the other end of the line unsettled him, but he pushed that aside. He had done his part. He shared everything he'd uncovered with her via email. Whatever happened next was up to her and her sleazebag husband. Blake wanted them left with nothing. Susan thought she could return to her life, to Blake, and their plans for a family. Roger thought he could walk away unscathed, as if none of this would touch him. Blake wasn't going to let that happen. Susan was nervous yet exhilarated as the trip began. Roger had planned everything: first-class flights to Italy, a luxurious hotel suite, and dinners at the finest restaurants. He had swept her off her feet with his grandeur. For a while, it was intoxicating. To be desired by a man like Roger, a man who commanded every room he entered, made her feel special, as though she were part of something much greater. Roger wanted her, and that meant something, didn't it? On the first night, they checked into the hotel, and everything seemed perfect. Roger had arranged for champagne to be waiting for them in the room, and they laughed, clinked glasses, and spent the evening in bed. The view of the city lights through the massive windows was breathtaking. Susan let herself be swept up in the charm and romance of it all. By the second day, things started to change. At first, it was subtle. Roger was still attentive but seemed somewhat distant. There was a look in his eyes that suggested the novelty of their getaway was already wearing off for him. Susan laughed at something he said over cocktails, but Roger didn't laugh back. Instead, he gave her a thin, dismissive smile, the kind she had seen him use with employees he considered beneath him. She didn't say anything. Maybe he was tired or distracted by something else. By the third day, Roger's distance became undeniable. He spent much of their time together checking his phone. When Susan spoke, he would occasionally nod but rarely engage. The glamorous dinners she had anticipated felt more like awkward business meetings. The waitresses fawned over Roger, clearly captivated by his charisma, and Susan felt herself shrinking into his shadow. She began to realize how little he truly cared about her. To him, she wasn't a partner. She was a trophy. That night, she reached for her phone, needing some form of connection, some comfort. But there was nothing. No messages, no missed calls. Blake hadn't tried to contact her, not even once. She wasn't sure if that was a relief or a disappointment. By the fourth day, Roger had all but lost interest in her outside the bedroom. He still paraded her around at lunches, introducing her to colleagues and acquaintances as if she were a prize, but there was no warmth in his actions. The thrill was gone for him. It wasn't until the fifth night that things took a humiliating turn. Roger invited two other women to their hotel room. When they arrived, he barely glanced at Susan. She was stunned but tried to mask her discomfort. "If you're not going to join us," Roger said with a shrug, "you can sleep on the couch." The words hit her like a slap. That night, she lay curled up on the couch, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. This wasn't what she had imagined. This wasn't the romance or excitement she had fantasized about. Roger didn't love her. He didn't even care about her. She was nothing more than a plaything, a disposable toy. Tears slid down her cheeks as the realization sank in. She had destroyed her marriage, betrayed the one person who had truly loved her, for this. For a man who saw her as nothing. By the sixth day, she was desperate to leave. She tried to talk to Roger, to share her feelings, to ask if everything was okay. But he brushed her off coldly. "Don't be dramatic, Susan. This trip was supposed to be fun." She forced a weak smile and nodded, but inside, she felt something break. She missed Blake, his warmth, his kindness, his stability. The trip had stripped away all the illusions she had about Roger, and now, all she wanted was to go home. On the seventh morning, Susan reached for her phone again, hoping to call Blake and hear his voice. But when she looked at the screen, she noticed something was off. There was no signal, no notifications, no missed calls. Panic began to creep in. She tried calling Blake from the hotel phone, but the call wouldn't connect. She tried calling her parents next, but the same error appeared. It was as if her phone had been disconnected from the world. Something was wrong. Deep down, she could feel it. But she convinced herself that Blake would explain everything when she returned home. He always did. Blake was her rock, her constant. He'd understand. He had to. The journey back brought Susan a sense of relief. She couldn't wait to leave. The luxury, the glamour, it all felt so fake and hollow. The shine had worn off, and all she wanted was to go home. She missed Blake. She missed his warmth, his kindness, his stability. She missed how safe she had always felt with him. With a heavy heart, Susan stared out the airplane window as the plane descended. She felt ashamed and confused by how deeply she had allowed herself to sink into Roger's world. Now the fantasy had shattered into pieces, leaving only emptiness. Roger was nothing more than a selfish, cold man who had used her. Susan realized that now, she understood what it felt like to be utterly degraded. She had become one of Roger's conquests. Tears stung her eyes as the truth overwhelmed her. All she wanted was to be back in Blake's arms, back where everything made sense. She would tell Blake how much she had missed him. She imagined returning home, falling to her knees, and begging for forgiveness. He would forgive her. He always did. He had to. Susan pulled over at the curb in front of her house. Her heart pounded wildly with excitement and fear. The trip had been a mistake, and she finally understood that. Roger wasn't the man she thought he was, and everything that had happened over the past week felt like a bad dream. But it was all behind her now. All she could think about was seeing Blake, falling into his arms and telling him how sorry she was. They would talk, and then they would move on. They would start over. But as she stepped out of the car, her stomach dropped. A bright, bold for sale sign stood on the lawn in front of the house. Susan froze. For sale? That couldn't be right. Blake hadn't mentioned anything about selling the house. Why would he do that? Her hands trembled as she approached the front door. She fumbled for her keys, her mind racing. The key fit into the lock but wouldn't turn. Confused, she tried again. It wouldn't budge. She jiggled it, pulled it out, and reinserted it, but still, nothing happened. Why wasn't it working? "Blake," she called out, knocking on the door with growing urgency. "Blake, are you there? It's me." There was no response. Her voice echoed faintly beyond the door. Susan's heart flipped as she moved to the window and peered inside. The house was empty, completely empty. No furniture, no pictures, no sign that anyone had ever lived there. "Blake," she whispered, her voice trembling. This wasn't just some big misunderstanding. Something was wrong. She reached for her phone and dialed Blake's number. The screen lit up, but the call wouldn't connect. An error message flashed. No service. Susan scrolled through the settings, trying to check the signal. Nothing. It was as if her phone had been disconnected entirely. She tried calling her parents next, but the same error appeared. No service. Her chest tightened. Panic bubbled beneath the surface. She got back into her car, her hands trembling as she started the engine. Blake will explain everything, she thought desperately. He wouldn't just leave like this. The drive to her parents' house passed in a fog as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Maybe there had been a mix-up with the house. Maybe Blake had gone to work and forgotten to tell her. Maybe, when she pulled up to her parents' house, she barely had time to turn off the engine before rushing to the front door. Her mother opened it before she could knock, her face tense with worry. "Susan," her mother said, her voice tight, "where have you been? We've been trying to reach you." Susan swallowed hard. "Something's wrong with my phone. I couldn't call anyone. What's going on, Mom?" "Blake, he changed the locks. The house is empty. What's happening?" Her mother let out a heavy sigh and stepped aside, gesturing for Susan to come inside. "You'd better sit down." "I don't want to sit down. I want to know what's going on." Susan's voice wavered, panic seeping into her tone. "Why can't I reach Blake? Why is our house up for sale?" Her father entered the room, quiet sadness etched across his face. "Blake is gone, Susan. He's left town. The house is on the market. Your things are in storage." The words hit her like a sledgehammer to the chest, and suddenly, it was hard to breathe. Gone. Her mind struggled to grasp what she was hearing. Blake is gone. He put the house up for sale. Her voice cracked. Why hadn't he told me? Why hadn't he called? "What do you mean, he's gone?" Susan's voice trembled, her heart pounding in her ears. "He wouldn't just leave me like that. He wouldn't leave. He loves me." Her parents exchanged glances, a look that only deepened her growing sense of dread. Her mother sat down beside her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Susan, he's not coming back. Blake called us a couple of days ago. He said you left with someone else and that it's over. He's put your things in storage, the house is up for sale, and he's filed for divorce." Susan blinked, struggling to process what she was hearing. Divorce? No, Blake wouldn't do that. He couldn't. He loved her. They were supposed to fix this. She had made a mistake, but they could work through it. "He said it's over?" she asked, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Just like that?" Her father nodded solemnly. "He said you knew what you were doing when you left with that man, that it was your choice, and now, this is his choice." Susan stared at her father, her mind struggling to process his words. "He said it was my choice," she repeated, her voice trembling. "I didn't want this to happen. I didn't want him to leave." Her mother sighed, her tone soft but firm. "Susan, what did you think would happen? You left him. You hurt him. You betrayed him. Did you think he'd just be waiting for you to come back as if nothing had happened?" Tears spilled down Susan's cheeks as she shook her head. I thought he'd understand. Blake always understood. He always forgave me. He loves me. He wouldn't just leave." Her father crossed his arms, his expression a mix of disappointment and sadness. "Blake isn't a doormat, Susan. You made your choice when you left with that man. Blake is making his choice now." Susan shot to her feet, pacing frantically across the living room. No, this can't be happening. I need to talk to him. He'll understand. He has to understand." Her voice cracked as she tried to convince herself more than anyone else. Her mother shook her head. "He changed his number. He's done, Susan. He said he didn't want any more contact with us either. He made it clear that this was final." The weight of her mother's words pressed down on her chest like a boulder. Susan felt her knees weaken as the reality of the situation sank in. Blake was gone, truly gone, and there was nothing she could say or do to fix it. She sank back into the chair, her hands trembling. I never thought it would end like this," she whispered, more to herself than to her parents. "I never thought." Her mother's voice softened, though it still held an edge of frustration. "Susan, you gambled with your marriage. You believed Blake would always be there for you no matter what. But people have limits. You crossed his." Susan buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. She had taken Blake's love for granted. She thought she could play with fire and not get burned. She thought she could return to the light she had left behind as if nothing had changed. But now, she stood in the ashes of her ruined life. Her mother's voice broke through her sobs. "You need to face the truth, Susan. Blake is gone, and it's because of the choices you made. You can't blame anyone else for this." Susan looked up, her tear-streaked face filled with desperation. "But I didn't mean for it to end like this. I thought he'd forgive me. He always forgave me." Her father spoke quietly, his words cutting through her grief. "Some things can't be forgiven." Susan sat in silence, the crushing weight of her actions finally sinking in. She had thrown away the one person who had truly loved her for a fleeting fantasy with a man who didn't care about her. Now, she was left with nothing. No home, no husband, no future. Her phone lay on the coffee table, dead and disconnected, much like her life felt now. The house was gone, Blake was gone, and the future she had once taken for granted had vanished, leaving only regret in its place. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.